Well, dear friends, we're enormously privileged and honored to have former Prime Minister Mr. Edouard Philippe with us today. He's joining us to continue with our joint reflections. Please give him a big hand. Prime Minister, we worked this morning. We had a number of speeches and interventions on these various international tensions and the different threats that could hover over us. We talked about the threat of nations turning in on themselves, particularly the big nations, the US and China, who may be tempted to look inwards instead of facing up to external threats, and the threats to our continent, Europe, and the globalization, which is somewhat challenged at the moment by this planetization. That's to say, this growing awareness that we must all face up to the pandemic and the paradox. The paradox is that people are turning inwards and looking at their own concerns first, but at the same time, we are jointly facing challenges that we must overcome together to save humanity. So that certainly causes a certain amount of chaos and disorder, and we're looking forward to your shedding a lot of light on all of this. We're used to hearing your wise words, and we'd like to hear what you have to say today about the international situation, the tensions that are rising and in the news on a daily basis, and a number of concerns that include what was said this morning about possible wars and conflicts. Some people believe this is inevitable, others not at all. But we are seeing a rise in violence, and we must all be very concerned and very worried by that. Thank you in advance then for your words and your thoughts about the future. We know it's an extraordinarily complex issue, but that's what we're here to discuss today. That's what the Futuroscope Forum is all about. Every year, it's up to our foundation to try and find steps forward for the future. Thank you once again for being here, and please come up to the lectern, and I want to give you the floor to open the deliberations of our forum for this afternoon's session. Thank you once again. Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. Ladies and gentlemen, MPs, presidents, and allow me, if I may, to say dear friends, even though I've not met some of you yet. Now, we need Jean-Pierre Raffarin's lively spirit, because you are asking us to step up to the plate, so to speak, in this changing and imbalanced world. You're the right man to stand up for this. Now, he asked me to come and take part in this, if you like, brainstorming session. I accepted for three reasons. First of all, our friendship, and the acknowledgement and respect that I have for him. I don't need, I think, to go into any more details, but of course, it's very important to say this, and I say that with my hand on my heart. Second reason I accepted, that he said very early on that this is a very serious subject, and that I would be speaking straight after the lunch break. And even if he didn't say it, and he didn't need to, I knew that I would allow your digestion to help you to get you through some of my less interesting points, perhaps. And finally, point is that it's a very, very interesting subject and enormously up to date. I haven't come to give a definitive speech or lay down any guidelines on what we ought to do. I wouldn't. I'm too humble to say that I would be able to do that. There are many people who are much better versed and smarter than I am here today. But the first thing we need to think about today is based on two different quotes. First of all, we need to mention literature, and Tolstoy at the end of the history in 1919, let me just say a few words that he said. From 1812, we saw that the European Sea had come back to its shores, but the mysterious forces driving humanity continued in their actions, even though the surface of the sea of history seemed to be very quiet. There was a continuous movement like time. Human groups were built and undone, and we saw the fall of empires and the migrations of people. The sea of history was no longer suddenly going from one shore to the other. It was bubbling in its depths. That's what Tolstoy had to say. The second quote I'd like to share with you to start off our work this afternoon. And I'm sure that something has to do with this. And Thucydides said, it's the rise of the fear by the Spartans of the rise in the power of Athens that inevitably caused the war between them. And that's Thucydides' trap for you. We know all about that, it's in the title. Now, if we look at the contrast, Tolstoy and Thucydides, we can contrast them and we can ask a question. Tolstoy says that the laws governing humanities and nations are incomprehensible. Thucydides, in his declaration, says or seems to suggest that there are laws and they need to be understood. And when we understand them, then we can deal with them or we can undo them. So we need to see how we can interpret this big difference between these two thinkers. Once again, I'm sure that some people will say, well, such a law does exist or can be undone, but I would like to take this opportunity to share with you a certain number of ideas and some convictions that I hold. First of all, I'm firmly convinced that in today's world, those who are not feeling dizzy with what's going on should really be a cause of a fear for us. We should be frightened of such people. People who are not reeling in the face of these changes are, if not dangerous, they're certainly very particular and very peculiar people. I mean, the world changes all the time. That's part of the nature of our world. But I think we can all agree that in the last few years, the last few decades, the changes that have been wrought in our lives and the challenges that we face are literally dizzying. I think we need to start with that. Dizzying changes. And I think there are many others, but at least there are three elements of this dizzying sensation that we have that need mentioning, as they're sensitive and very significant. First of all, demographics, dizzying changes in demographics. I think that is the first and most important because it influences the others. You have an idea of the numbers, 1 billion in 1800, 9 billion now, probably 10 billion in a very few years. A massive increase in the world population and very significant. The second very important point from a demographic point of view, in terms of the world population, the gap between, for example, the very rapid growth of population in Africa and the slow decline and drop in population within Europe. Just a few figures. Europe today, depending on how you count, about 500 million. So 1 billion people in Africa, looking to 2.5 billion within just a few decades. 2010, the population was 1 billion. So look at the increase to 2.5 billion. I'm saying that this is a very significant increase. This is doubling of population of Nigeria and Ethiopia by 2050, and a quadrupling of the population of the Democratic Republic of Congo. We're looking at an increase from about 50 million to 200 million by 2050 in this country. In 2019, there were 5.3 million deaths in Europe and 5 million births. So in 2019, the European population grew thanks to immigration. In 2020, because of COVID, basically, and the closing of a number of immigration routes, the net population of Europe fell. So we really do have a situation which is dizzying in terms of its difference, and its size is very significant. As you look at the median age is about 43 years in Europe. It will go up a little bit because in 2050 it will be 47. For Africa, median age is 20. In 2050 it will be 25. So an aging population in Europe with a stagnating population, stable population, and Africa with a growing and young population. So that's another point. And the third dizzying change in demographics, which is not only demographic, urbanization, which is also dizzying in its pace around the world. When should we start to count the start of the Industrial Revolution? 1820 is a good enough place. There are others who suggest that there could be other dates, but 1820 is a good enough date to start. And this is when France became a country where more than 50% of the population live in cities. That started in 1931 in France, and it took another 50 years for 80% of the French population to live in cities. So more or less, it took about 170 years for France to go from a very rural country to a principally urban country. Now in China, they didn't need to wait 90 years. We're looking at a 40-year period. And behind all that, so 2 generations, let's say, and behind that you can imagine the incredible tension as far as this social fabric is concerned, family solidarity, which is affected, and this phenomenon of the urbanization of the world in a way that has never been considered before and never been seen before. The second major chapter, the second major dizzying set of changes, closely linked to the first one, is the dramatic changes in the environment. I think we've got all the figures already in our heads, but if we look at global warming, rising sea levels, allow the mayor of Le Havre to say this. This was, in fact, the first port in France. I'm sorry to the people from Marseille to say that. But the problems and the challenges that we see in Le Havre and other ports due to rising sea levels, because this is something that you can see with your own eyes, and it's making things very, very difficult to build in the lower part of the city because of the flood risk. And what will happen by 2100 in terms of sea levels. And people want to move on to the cliff tops. This is something investors and architects are facing today, and the state is facing in terms of the rules it's setting out. And Le Havre, I think, will do okay. There's 180,000 people, we'll manage. But we need to look at the disappearance of rural areas, of farming areas, of green areas, and the challenges that are already underway. Of course, we've heard about the forest fires. We know about the terrible fires in Siberia, but the famine in Madagascar as a result of the climate change, and it is really having far-reaching changes and effects. And I can talk about many other factors, but these are things that we should literally be worried about. Thirdly, China, dizzying changes in China. Well, dizzying changes throughout Asia, but let's look at China. In 30 years, China has experienced what took 250 years in Europe in terms of industrial revolution, societal revolution, complete change. It's always very interesting to listen to. In fact, China used more cement, more concrete between 2013 and 2015 than the US in the whole of the 20th century. And the increase in Chinese GDP between 2014 and 2016 is, in fact, higher than India's GDP in a year. I mean, look at what Kissinger said. He went to 1970. I went to China, which is essentially rural at the time. Very, very different to the country that we know today. And Kissinger said that in 1970, if he had been shown the photos taken today of China, with all of his experience and all of his intelligence, he would have said, this is literally impossible. That just can't be a thing. The transformation of China is a megalopolis like Rome, built every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, a city as big as Rome is built. As indeed, Graham T. Allison said, Rome wasn't built in a day. And this incredible, dizzying transformation of infrastructures is spectacular when we talk about infrastructures, when we say there are more high-speed train lines than in China than in the entire world put together. That also concerns the entrepreneurial capacity, research, education. It's not only about material investment, it's a collective dynamism, a collective appetite for growth, which is absolutely exceptional. Showing to many that this actor which is emerging is perhaps not the most powerful of the time, but the most powerful actor in the history of the world. In 2018, I had been to China. I was the Prime Minister of France at the time, and at the end of our interview, I was told by Xi Jinping, he knew that for a long time that many nations had shouldered the universe over the years, and now China was helping to hold up the universe, but that he wasn't worried because China was prepared to carry the whole weight of the universe on its shoulders. It's quite a poetic expression, but when you think about it, it's also quite significant. And the consequence of this is the dizzying rise of China that we've just been talking about. We look at technological changes, and we could add a series of other ones, but allow me just to say that in the face of the dizzying changes, those who are not feeling dizzy are a source of worry to me.
Que ces vertiges finalement peuvent tendre.
So, what are the consequences of some of these dizzying changes? So, as the title of this afternoon's colloquium, which is Thucydides' trap, and so we talked about the rise of one power faced with another already dominant power can inevitably lead to war. So I'd like to do a little parenthesis to say that I'm so pleased to see this great intellectual debate that actually came about by an American scholar. And often we in France do that, but it's nice to see that an American came up with this theory. So, and it's not a random theory, and it's important. We shouldn't be worried or have a complex about the fact that another scholar from another country could come up with such an interesting idea. So, misunderstanding and fear is emerging between the United States and China. We see more and more dangers. We see emerging hurdles or breaks, or the notion of it. We see military strengthening, which is provoked by one's fear and the other's power. And it might be the first time in a long time that we see a different type of distribution in the world, and it's based on technological advances. And we see that we're coming to technological differences between the Western world and the East. For a long time in technological matters, we actually had a worldwide convergence, but we're seeing that there's the beginning of some differences. And this is not nothing. So we see this inevitable confrontation in the vein of Thucydides' trap coming about again. So a point on this book and other books on the subject, we must underscore the role of leaders in this dynamic. There's a very interesting book written by Christopher Clark on the causes that led up to the First World War, and it's called The Sleepwalkers. It says that all of the political decision makers of the time behaved as sleepwalkers. They were sleepwalking through the impact of the decisions that they were taking at that time. And we're seeing some patterns repeat. Political, economic decision makers, and even citizens' thoughts on the world in which we live is one of the key pieces in this. Any thought, any insight, any debate can contribute to understanding the situation. And it's important to consider that. another important point that's a little bit different from 100 years ago is that we have had nuclear weapons as a means of dissuasion since 1945. For a long time, we thought about war without thinking about the dissuasive existence of these nuclear weapons. Now, that's one trap. The second trap I want to talk about, and I hope you won't think that I'm being too provocative here, but let me say it clearly. A strong China could be a trap, yes, but a weak China is not a better alternative. Let me explain. Many people have said that where you have an emerging power against an established power, and if the new power rising did not play the game, well, then it could cause worse damage or have worse consequences. So in the 1930s, we saw when the United Kingdom was surpassed in power by the United States. But Americans did not want to bear the weight of the world's problems. And that is a very worrisome trap indeed. Why? Because there is no world power that is that can keep up with China's meteoric rise. And if we don't have a counterbalance, we don't have a solution to the problem. Also, on the other hand, a weak China, an independent China, or one that doesn't respect laws could be as dangerous as a powerful China left unchecked. The third trap for us French or Europeans is dissuasion. So you're in a dangerous situation when you're in a triangular or a three-pronged relationship. So when we were found in trapped between Bismarck's trap between the US and the other side, if Europe doesn't establish itself as that third pillar, it could be left out of the fray, left behind. And being left further behind than Greece was in the time of Roman power. And there's another risk that we become a sort of Chinese counter. And that's a big risk because we all know what it is to live in a world dominated by the United States. Whether you're for or against it, you like it or not, it's a fact. We know what that is, but we don't know what it's like to live in a world that's dominated by another power other than the United States. How much sovereignty would we have? How much identity would we keep? And how do we get out from Bismarck's trap that I just described? But through influence or with another ally? Well, so just like the Three Musketeers were actually four, there's a fourth trap here, which is quite worrisome for political leaders. And that is the trap that you're least expecting. And that is worrisome indeed. The trap that we're not anticipating is when we're not one of the two powers, well, then we are basically, we find ourselves in the periphery. And we find ourselves in a very difficult situation because we're not in the heart of the confrontation. but we still risk, we're still in danger. So what would be worse than China, which didn't want to participate in a world in its place as a world power, but there's a risk of confrontation with Mediterranean powers. And this risk does indeed exist, in my opinion, and I think we have to be very careful of that fourth trap. So what do we do? How can we handle these four different traps? I obviously don't have a definitive answer. I can't make a declaration and say this is what's going to do. But I can suggest three avenues, three paths to take. One, it would be unrealistic to think that France alone can counter the United States on one side and China on the other. But what would be even more unreasonable would be to not value our strength. So I think we can work within our means, with the wherewithal at our disposition, to be a European power. It's a pretty traditional political strategy, is to try to be not France strong as a world power, but a strong France within Europe. Some people are skeptical of this, others believe in this model. What I think is important, what I often observe is that people who don't necessarily agree with this position don't have a viable alternative. So what are our strengths? Our culture, our able to make ourselves heard, our economic power, all of these put together can contribute to building a strong Europe. And if that is the case, a strong Europe can and should play a role to counter these two poles. So I think that that is one path we can take, a first path. And when you hear in theory, it is pretty representative of French policy. In practice, it's hard to implement. It's hard to force our country to be stronger, and Jean-Pierre is well placed to confirm my statement. The second point, second avenue that is important to get out of this trap, to lead us out of this trap, is intelligence and unilateralism. Excuse me, multilateralism. And the idea is to create intelligence with others. And since we're France and we're part of Europe, we need to be very careful in how we exchange and understand our American partners and our Chinese partners on the other side. On the one hand, Americans, it's not just because we speak English well enough that we understand everything. We share some cultural codes, others not. And I think it would be illusory to say that just because we share some roots, that we are naturally allies. Because you can see it's not even true for the British. Now, on the other hand, we do not have many shared roots with the Chinese. Different language, different culture. China has been somewhat cut off from us for a very long time. But it's absolutely essential that we create ties and links As I said with Jean-Pierre, he's one example of it. But he's not the only example of this desire to create links with a country that remains very difficult for us Westerners to understand. So we have to have multilateralism and intelligence. Multilateralism is good because everybody needs to make themselves heard in today's world. But that's not just what it means. It means that we have strengths and it's in our best interest to contribute to growth. And it's much better to build rather than destroy a world together. And we can discuss this together. And this holds true in all kinds of fields, whether it be the environment, trade, etc. And so multilateralism has been called into question in many fields, but we need to continue to endeavor to create links, to build trust. Also, I would like to add that China doesn't necessarily want to take on this role. And the third avenue is important for a country like France, because many people question, where is France? Where is France headed? But we need to know what we believe and defend our beliefs, because we have to defend our fundamental values and interests, and if we don't, we risk scattering ourselves, scattering our efforts, our resources. And I think that there is a very strong political will to clearly establish our interests, defend our values. This is nothing new. The current administration and previous administrations have thought about this a lot, but I'm not sure that in thinking about this, in trying to define and clearly express our values, I don't know that this has necessarily been done clearly enough. And clear enough so that we know exactly in what direction we're headed. In any case, finding balance in this imbalanced world or amongst these dizzying changes means that we have to listen and understand the world around us as much as possible. It's a risky endeavor and somewhat dangerous. Thank you very much for your attention.